heroes! It is I, Tentus Dracovin, Lord and Emperor of the Dracovin Empire, and welcome! It is time to continue our discussion on D20 Modern, the modern take on the 3rd edition of Dungeons & Dragons. Let's continue where we were talking about. We were talking about combat and, of course, injury. Let's talk about what happens when you get a lot of injury and move into dying, and then we'll move on to talking a little bit about moving around during combat. So dying, though. When you reach 0 hit points from getting beat up and stuff, you've reached this point where you're still conscious, but you're disabled. You're in such a shape that you're like, oh, you're on your last legs. You can only take a move or a standard action, and you can't take a full round or both of them. And if you do any kind of strenuous if you don't do any kind of strenuous movement, you're fine. You're just like, you can just like sort of like walk around a little bit, you're injured, you try maybe wander off to get help, but as soon as you do some kind of strenuous movement or a standard action or like an attack action, you've pushed yourself too far and you aggravate your wounds and you fall unconscious and start dying. Now this would occur after you've completed your action. So if you would do some kind of action which would in fact heal you, you would take one damage and go into negatives at the end of that action, whatever action it would be, but if it would heal you, then you'd get those hit points back. If it doesn't heal you, you're like, one final attack, and you would fall over. Now when you reach -1 to -9, you're dying. You're unconscious, you can't do any actions, you're just sort of sitting there and bleeding out. The possibility you could either die or stabilize. Those are the two things that will occur when you're from -1 to -9. Now when you reach -10, you die. The other way to die at this point in time is if your constitution through ability damage reaches 0, you also die. Those are the two big ways of dying for your character. Now you can recover on your own unaided by anybody. If you've reached -1 to -9, you are not out of the woods. You're in pretty bad shape, but you're not necessarily going to die if no one comes to rescue you. You get a fortitude save DC 20 each round. If you fail it, you take a damage. You're bleeding out, effectively. If you succeed at it, though, you've stabilized. You are still unconscious, but you are no longer bleeding to death. Then, within 1 hour, after an hour has gone by, while you're still unconscious, and if someone's still not helping you, you can make another fortitude save, DC 20. If you fail, you're still unconscious. If you succeed, you become conscious. You're now disabled like you would be at 0 health, but you're awake and at whatever negative it is. It works exactly like when you're at 0. If you do some kind of strenuous activity, you're wounding yourself, you're dying, but you have the chance of then, moving yourself to somewhere to perhaps get help at that point in time. If you would have failed, you can try every hour after that. Now, if again, you somehow do not get any help and you attempt to recover from this you don't heal naturally when you're at negatives. Now, if you're at 0 or above, you would heal naturally just by sort of resting. If I'm at negatives and I attempt to heal naturally, after a day, I have to make a fortitude save, DC 20 yet again. If I succeed at it, then I no longer have to worry about getting damage to me, any kind of negative kind of thing happening, losing health from whatever activities. I'm still disabled, but I'm healing naturally, and what actions I would do would no longer cause me to bleed out. I would have been like, oh, I'm finally recovering. If I fail it, I take a damage. So I bleed some more. I'm bleeding slowly to death. It doesn't drop you anymore. You're still like conscious there, but you're like, oh, can't heal on my own. Now someone can assist you. They can treat injury using the skill DC 15 while you're in negatives. This will stabilize you, meaning it stops you from bleeding out. Then, just like before, you can attempt after an hour a fortitude save DC 20 to wake up. Succeed, you're awake. Fail, you're still unconscious, you get up, you're disabled, but because they've treated your injury, you do not have that threat of bleeding out anymore, and you would heal naturally when you would rest. So you've been in a position that I'm still okay to rest. Now, when you are resting, if you rest for an evening, effectively 8 hours, you recover 1 hit point per level that you have, for character level you have. So if you're a 5th level character, you would recover 5 hit points for resting an evening. Now, if you rest an entire day, 24 hours, full bed rest, you heal double that. You effectively heal double your character level. So if I'm, again, 5th level, I would heal 10 hit points. It's sort of a representation that higher level characters are a little tougher the injuries to them might not be as grievous for the same amount of damage as it would be to a lower level character, therefore they recover from it sort of at the same rate, I would say. Now, ability score damage, should it occur to you, that also recovers at a certain rate as you rest. For an evening's rest of 8 hours, you recover 1 ability score damage. Full day's rest, full bed rest, 2 ability score damage. Now, certain abilities or things could give you temporary hit points. Temporary hit points are treated differently than your normal hit points. You would keep track of what your current hit points are. You would add those temporary hit points effectively to your total that you have. Those temporary hit points, meaning that you've added them on, would go first when someone is damaging you. That means, like, if I get 5 temporary hit points, I had 10 life, I now have effectively 15 health. I can take 5 extra damage before it begins to affect my previous current hit points again in my normal total. Temporary hit points are, like it says, temporary depending on the type of ability. And the other thing about it is you never can recover from them. Natural healing or any kind of special healing, like with medical technology, does not recover them whatsoever. They just exist to be a sort of buffer to your own health that exists, as it says, temporarily. Now, your constitution can change. Whether this is temporarily or permanently, when your constitution goes up, you gain more health. It just as your modifier might change, since your modifier added to whatever dice roll you had, depending on your class, determines your hit points. When your modifier goes up, so does your hit points. Now, if this is a temporary boost, of course, yes, I'm getting these hit points, and they count as actual hit points, not temporary hit points. Even if the Constitution raise is itself temporary, they count as normal hit points. As soon as I would lose that temporary hit points, or for whatever reason my Constitution goes back down, then the hit points I would have gained go away. Regardless of the shape I am, I would lose that amount of hit points to my health. And so it functions as though real hit points, so they can be healed accordingly just the same too. Now let's talk about some of the basics of movement. Of course, as a human, you're going to have 30 feet of movement in combat, and movement is very important to combat. You're going to be moving around regardless, getting in position, maneuvering yourself for better shots, or to get some defense against, oncoming bullets, or maybe to get away from someone that's kind of hunting you down, something like that goes on. You're going to move. There are things that could alter your movement, though. We're talking just being human, so most of people are going to be humans anyway in most D20 modern games. But you can be hindered, of course, by encumbrance. Holding something that weighs a lot will slow you down. Like if you're carrying the knocked out body of your friend, you're going to be a lot slower than if you weren't. Armor can also affect your speed, too. Normally, you would get your single movement, or your double movement if you're not doing an attack action, or your run, or if you're just doing a full round action, the 5-foot step. Now, your movement is hindered if you're in the total darkness. If you can't see anything in total darkness, your speed is reduced to half what it would be. So the 30, if that's what you have, is reduced to 15. Anything slower than that reduced by, of course, encumbrance or armor, that would be halved accordingly. Now, I can move through things' spaces. If I'm moving through a friendly character's space, does not affect me whatsoever. They're going to let me through. That means I could run by a buddy. Well, probably not run because that you can't be hindered. But I can move by a buddy to get in a position to melee attack when they're range attacking. They're firing a gun. I could pop ahead of them and be like, look out, I'm coming in to sword that dude. I don't know, I'd be swording in a modern setting, but maybe I want to sword something in a modern setting. If it's an enemy, though, that causes some complications. Someone that doesn't want you to pass through their spare. Well, there's 2 things an enemy could do. They could allow you to pass through their square, and it's treated just like a friendly would be. They could be like, maybe it's better for me to let this guy run by me. Maybe he wants to really go after that guy back there and not me. I'll let him go after it because it might give me a chance, especially if I want to run away, to escape. On the other hand, I could block him. Then, the person running at me has 2 options. 1, they can attempt an overrun maneuver over me. I will talk about that a little later, what that means to do an overrun, but they could try that. Or 2, they could use the tumble skill to attempt to move through my space. The rules on that are described under tumble, so if you've taken that skill, you have that option to move through my square. Granted, if you fail, you're probably not going to move at all, and I'm going to get an attack of opportunity on you, but you tried. Now, if something is 3 size categories larger than you, so if you're fighting some kind of like monster or something that's huge or like something really bigger than you, it doesn't stop you. You can just move through its space. Doesn't mean you won't provoke an attack of opportunity, but you can move through its space unhindered. Let's talk about grids, because I do want to mention this a little bit, because normally when we're talking on movement, you're going to measure everything in squares / 5 feet. You're going to want to try to do that as much as possible. When you use a grid, where you're using miniatures, that's the easiest way that you're going to measure out movements. So I would be on this grid, I'd have my miniatures, I'd move around. Every 1 inch square, because 1 inch squares are preferred, counts as 5 feet in this world. So I would move 5 feet at a time. If I'm not using a grid or anything and we're just using our minds, you want to try to keep things to that 5 feet measurement because it keeps everything simple. 30 feet, that's 6 of these squares, or you can divide it up into 5 feet increments. These make things easy for you to do, and you don't have to worry about a lot of math at times because of that. You don't have to keep track of these exact numbers because you're just keeping track of these 5 feet. It makes it easier. Now, moving around the grid, of course, you can go up, down, left, and right between those, but you can also move diagonally. So it's an 8 direction movement. Diagonals work a little differently, though. First square you do counts as 1 square / 5 feet of movement. Second diagonal counts as 2 squares, 10 feet of movement. So for every 2 diagonals, I have moved effectively what 3 squares in a straight line would have been, or 15 feet, also in that straight line. So diagonals do drag you down a little bit, but again, it's a pretty simple system. You have to remember 1, then 2, 1, then 2, 1, then 2, to infinite. Now let's talk about flanking, because something you can maneuver yourself to do. If my buddy's facing off against an enemy, and I sneak around to be the exact opposite side of my buddy, then we're flanking with him. Now this only happens if both of you are threatening them. You can't do that with ranged weapons. You have to have melee to be threatening. You know, I can't flank with a gun. I could flank with a sword or a dagger or my fist if I'm trained with it, if I'm trained to be lethal and threatening. Then, while you're flanking, you get a +2 bonus to attack against it. So we both get this +2 to pummel this guy. We've got an advantage. Now, I will briefly mention it now. When you talk about larger creatures, there's an entire set of different rules for space, reach, and positioning that are very important to it. But because you're very rarely going to deal with that in this modern setting, we'll talk about it a little later. We're going to go over that in its own section. But for now, just know that larger creatures get a little different when it comes to these rules. So that's it for today. I talked about, of course, dying in combat and being dead, and what happens when you hit that death level, and a little bit about recovery from that terrible, terrible situation, and recovery in general, of course. I then moved into talking about the basics of some movement in combat, talking about what it means to move around through people's squares, flanking, and of course moving around just on a grid in general. Very important information to know. In the next episode, I'm going to talk about things that modify you in combat modifiers, and moving into special kind of actions, most often associated with your initiative. Continuing, of course, in the combat section. So, any questions, comments, anything you would say, anything you think I left out? Please just leave in the comments below. Please like, share, and subscribe. It shows you support the channel, the Empire, the work I do. If you want to show some extra support, you can always check out my Patreon. Linked in the description below. But regardless, until the next time, I bid you farewell.